This is Albania. Tucked away in the southeast corner of Europe, it was once one of the most isolated countries in the world. From 1944 until 1991, the country was led by a communist regime that was built entirely on fear and control. And the man behind it all was a politician by the name of Enver Hoxha. He ruled Albania for over 40 years and during that time made the country into what some have called the North Korea of Europe. To further understand what the country was like under his rule, we first need to go over how he came to power. During the Second World War, Albania was under Axis occupation. It was invaded by Italy in 1939 and occupied by both Italian and German forces until 1944, when Albania's communist resistance managed to push them out. Just like any other country in Europe at that time, Albania suffered a lot. Over 60,000 houses were destroyed and more than 10% of the population was left without a home. It was reported that Albania was one of the most devastated countries in the region. This is where Enver Hoxha enters the picture. He played a key role in forming Albania's resistance movement, and after successfully pushing out the Germans, he was now looking to become the next head of state. This was a fairly easy task considering that the government established by the Axis fell apart soon after Germany's withdrawal. Hoxha took power in 1944, marking the beginning of a dark chapter in Albania's history. In the first couple years of his rule, he did everything to consolidate his power. He killed anyone who opposed communism and went on to suppress religion, outlaw freedom of speech, and to ensure no one could enter or leave the country, he closed the border. This was his first step in isolating Albania. During his brutal rise to power, Hoxha also dealt with Albania's post-war recovery, and to do that, he completely transformed the way the country functioned. He seized land from rich landowners and turned it into collective farmland, making Albania completely self-sufficient in food production. Meanwhile, electricity, which at the time only few had access to, was brought to every rural district in the country. Hoxha also introduced several educational policies which significantly dropped the literacy rate from 83% in the 1940s down to just 30% in the 1950s. All in all, Hoxha played a major role in Albania's recovery. But even with these policies, he would often use brutal tactics to implement them. And as he settled deeper into power, his fear of foreign and domestic enemies only grew stronger. The thing with Hoxha is that he was a hardcore communist. He firmly believed it was the perfect system to live by and viewed anyone who thought otherwise as an enemy. But it wasn't just communism he was obsessed with, it was his vision of communism that mattered the most. This would play a major role in shaping Albania's foreign policy and is ultimately what made it so isolated. If we look at Albania's southern and western borders, we see Greece and Italy. At this point in time, both of them are part of NATO, an alliance that is openly anti-communist. That alone was enough for Hoxha to mark them as enemies. Meanwhile, the US, one of the founding members of NATO, and who also helped Hoxha fight off the Axis during World War II, wasn't exactly thrilled with his growing anti-Western stance. In an attempt to get Albania on their side, they came up with a plan to overthrow him. It was called Operation Valuable, and the goal was simple: remove Enver Hoxha and replace him with a pro-Western leader. The US and its NATO allies trained Albanian expats and secretly sent them into the country, hoping they could spark a rebellion from within. But the operation ultimately failed. As mentioned earlier, Hoxha completely closed Albania's borders, making it nearly impossible for any foreign agents to enter. But the few who did were captured, imprisoned, and executed. This was a major blunder by the West, as it not only worsened its already fragile relationship with Albania, but also gave credibility to Hoxha's paranoia. Moving over to Albania's northern border, we see Josip Tiro's Yugoslavia. You would think that since the two states share the same ideology, they would be allies, but that wasn't the case here. Being both communists, Tiro and Hoxha got along pretty well at first. They fought alongside each other during the Second World War and played a major role in kicking out the Axis from Southern Europe. After the war, they would go on to sign several economic and political agreements that would bring the two countries together. However, this short-lived friendship would fall apart after the Tito-Stalin split. The problem was that Tito's and Hoxha's idea of communism was in reality very different. Tito believed in a more flexible, decentralized, and nationally tailored version of socialism, while Hoxha had a more traditional Stalinist view of it. These ideological differences weren't acceptable to Hoxha, and his view on Tito had changed completely. After this, Albania had completely cut ties with its neighbor to the north, leaving it with just one ally in the region. There was only one foreign leader that Hoxha fully trusted, and that was Joseph Stalin. Under Stalin, Albania and the Soviet Union were close allies. They were major trade partners, and since Albania was part of the Warsaw Pact, it was protected by the Soviet Union. But this alliance also didn't last long. After Stalin's death in 1953, Nikita Khrushchev took over, and he condemned Stalin and all the brutal policies he had adopted. Khrushchev began the process of what was called de-Stalinization. He began easing political repression, improving relations with the West, and promoting a more relaxed version of communism, similar to Tito's Yugoslavia. This, as you can imagine, angered Hoxha. To him, this was a betrayal of everything communism stood for. He believed Khrushchev had sold out to the West and abandoned Marxist values. In response, Hoxha cut ties with the Soviets and publicly criticized Khrushchev's leadership, accusing him of weakening the world's communist revolution from within. Once again, Hoxha chose isolation over compromise, and with each ally he pushed away, Albania drifted further into total isolationism. After breaking ties with the Soviet Union, Hoxha began looking for a new trusted ally, and that led him to Maoist China. The two countries established diplomatic relations in November 1949, shortly after Mao Zedong, the leader of China's Communist Party, took over as head of state. Hoxha saw Mao's regime as the last true defender of communist orthodoxy. Both leaders rejected Khrushchev's reforms and pushed for a strict, hardline version of communism. Throughout their alliance, China often provided Albania with financial aid, industrial equipment, and political support, all which gave a big boost to its closed-off economy. But over time, Hoxha started demanding more from China, which ended up straining their relationship. Mao, who saw value in keeping Albania as an ally, usually tolerated these demands. But after his death in 1976, his successor, Hua Guofeng, made the decision to cut all aid. His administration also began opening up to the West. From that point on, Hoxha fully turned against the Chinese government and went on to suspend all trade, cultural, educational, and technological ties with China. And this was the moment that Albania became all alone. Hoxha's obsession with true communism had completely isolated Albania from the rest of the world, and he was now more paranoid than ever before. He was convinced that all his former allies were now out to get him. And he wasn't entirely wrong. Throughout his time as head of state, there were several efforts to overthrow him, both from within and outside Albania. In order to counter those attempts, he continued persecuting his people, turning Albania into a surveillance state that monitored everything and anything that might threaten his power. This led to thousands being imprisoned, tortured, or executed in forced labor camps, while the families of these so-called traitors were denied education and jobs. As mentioned before, religion was seen as a threat for the regime and was banned in 1967. Churches, mosques, and monasteries were all closed and demolished. Meanwhile, all forms of media were tightly controlled, with all foreign books, films, and music being made illegal. All of this was done to neutralize any domestic threats, and in order to protect himself from foreign ones, Hoxha launched a massive nationwide defense program that would fortify Albania. From the 1960s until the 1980s, over 170,000 concrete bunkers were built. They were scattered across every region in the country, each one designed to hold 2 to 4 soldiers. For a country as small and as poor as Albania, the project drained huge amounts of resources. Money that could have gone into housing, infrastructure, or healthcare instead went into bunkers that were never really going to be used in the first place. And with almost no trade, no innovation, and no foreign investment, Albania stayed one of the poorest countries in Europe. This is how Hoxha's regime ran the country for over 40 years. His paranoia and obsession with true communism held the country back for decades. In 1973, he suffered a heart attack from which he never fully recovered. From that point on, he had faced several health-related problems, and seeing that he was too weak to rule, he handed most state functions to his right-hand man, Ramiz Alia. The two shared power until April 1985, when Hoxha's rule and life came to an end from heart failure. This would mark the beginning of the end of Albania's communist regime. In 1992, shortly after the collapse of the Soviet and Yugoslav communist states, Albania too decided that it was done with communism. After several nationwide protests broke out, Hoxha's communist regime fell, and the country began its transition to capitalism. The first couple years of it weren't exactly easy. Albania's newly elected government was either too slow to act or ignored the nation's problems they had promised to solve entirely. but as of 2025, Albania has made a lot of progress since the 1990s. While the country does still face certain challenges, it is no longer isolated or authoritarian. It has integrated itself with the West, joining NATO in 2009 and is on track to join the EU by 2030. Despite its dark past, Albania has found a way to move forward, leaving the ugly chapter of the Cold War behind.